Okay. I believe we were just in the middle of the sugya of not by not. And the Gemara was discussing a case of dogim she'olu b'ka'ira shabishal babasar. You took fish right off a barbecue grill. It was piping hot. You put it onto a plate, a plate. The loch is you're allowed to eat that fish together with cheese, together with milchiks, because, as Shmuel says, it's not by not. Never was there an actual contact between this fish and meat. It only came into contact with a secondary flavor of meat that was absorbed into the plate. Now, Tosus brings up an important shaila that was raised to Rashi, and Rashi paskined luchum. Tosus asks, what would be not you just put a piece of fish on the plate that was fleischiks? What if you actually cooked an egg in a pot that was milchiks? Can I use this egg now to make a meat knish? Can I use this egg in my cholent? So Rashi says that's worse than not by not, because when you're cooking with water, it will extract more tam from the wall of the pot than just throwing a hot piece of fish on a plate. And Toshas actually says that it seems like it would be totally in two different pshatim of Rashi in the Gemara that we last learned. The Gemara said that even though in a case of not by not, you're allowed to eat it with meat, but if you cut a sharp radish with a fleischiga knife, that would be worse, and it would be usher to eat that radish with milchiks. And Rashi says there's two reasons for that. That's right over here at the top of Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Rashi says two reasons. And the two reasons that Rashi says would pivot onto the shaila that we asked with cooking. Would it make a difference? So if you look at Rashi, avosakin, when you're cutting a piece of radish with a knife, sometimes there's a small residue of actual fleischiks, and when you cut the knife, if you cut the radish with the knife, not by not. There's actual real meat flavor that's on that knife. Now, if that's shot in Rashi, then you don't see anything with the shot of cooking. But look at the next svara that Rashi says. V'oid demishum churfei bola fei midogim harois. Even if there's only a tam of fleischiks in this knife, there's no actual mamoshes, but since the tznoin is sharp, it will extract more than tamazoi, a hot piece of fish sitting on a plate. The sharpness will suck more in, and sakina, sakina. So there's a double action here. The pressure of the knife will force more tam out of the knife, and the sharpness of the radish will suck and absorb more tam out of the knife as well. And therefore it will be us. The Tosfos, if putting a knife and having a sharp vegetable will suck more out, surely cooking that egg in that milchiga pot will suck out all of the milchiks into the egg, and then you couldn't use that egg with fleischiks. So those are the two stuff. Now we happen to paskin that's also not by now. If you cook an egg in a milchiga pot, you're absolutely allowed to put that egg into your chop. And we paskin that if you cook an egg in a fleischiga pot, if you cook if you cook macaroni in a fleischiga pot, you're actually allowed to mix that with cheese and have macaroni and cheese even though the macaroni was cooked in a fleshik pot, because it's not brenat. Now, this is only b'di'evet. It doesn't say you're allowed to take dogim lechatchila and place them on a fleshik plate to eat with kutach. That if b'di'evet you already placed the dogim on the plate, then we would allow you to eat it with kutach. However, there are cases where you could be more mekel, and you could lechatchila put dogim on a fleshik plate and lechatchila plan to eat it with kutach. And that's where it's Einoi Ben Yoim. Let's say you haven't used this fleshik pot in 24 hours. Then you're lechatchila allowed to prepare and put hot dogim on it, and you can, in order to be able to eat it with milk. Or on the flip side, a fleshik pot that's not Ben Yoimah, you're lechatchila allowed to cook macaroni in it with the intention that you're going to mix that macaroni with cheese. Because there's another factor here that is Ein Ben. Okay. Zok the head of the Gemara Vayt. Aval kishois. But if you were cutting with a knife, a softer type of item, meaning it's not so sharp, then gar lebei piskiva. All you would have to do is scrape off the top surface, just in case there's any shamnunis of isura, you just scrape it off, and that is adequate. What about kilchi belifta? If you cut stems of lefes, shori, because lefes is not a sharp vegetable, but the silka of beets, that's sharp. Assyria would be also. The ipasach behu, the lifta shapridami. If Rashi says you mix them together, the sharp vegetable with the more bland vegetable, and if you cut one piece of lefes and one piece of beets at the same time, the lefes is mevatel the tam of shamnunis from the knife, and then it will stop the sharper object from absorbing. Somehow, if you cut first with the bland vegetable, it will weaken the tam even more. That now even the sharp vegetable will no longer extract now. Rav Dimi Rav Nachman. Rav Dimi has to follow the shayla of Rav Nachman. Ma'ula nuchi kada de milcha gabi kada de kib. If you have a container of salt, are you allowed to keep it side by side with kutach? And of course, the concern is that some kutach might fall into the middle. It's white. Some kutach might fall into the salt. It's white. You might not notice it, and then you might use that salt to salt something fleishiks with, not realizing that there's actually some milchiks, some real milchiks there. Over late, Rav Nachman answered osir, because we are actually genuinely afraid that some kutach will get mixed into the salt. What about the chalomah? Vinegar as well. You need to be concerned of having kutach near vinegar, because some of the kutach might fall into the vinegar, just like we were concerned about the salt. Amalei, shori, that would be mut. So he asked Rav Nachman, what's the difference? So Rav Nachman answered, this is already behind the paywall. When you bring for me a core of salt, in other words, you're going to have to bring me something, and you want me to tell you this extra pshat, you're going to have to provide the service for me as well. Measure me a core of milk. My time, I'll tell you the reason. If some kudach falls into salt, the actual kudach remains intact, and that actual kudach you might be putting into meat. If you take some salt, you might take a piece of kudach with. But the highlights say Yisur Beinei. If kutach fell into vinegar, it would have been diluted and it wouldn't be bad, and that's why we're not so. Hobar Guzla, there was a small bird. The nafal akada de kimcha. It fell into kutach. So the question is, Is there a problem because it fell into a milking liquid? Zok to Gemara. Shari Rab Chanina Barei Derava Mi Pashrunya. Rab Chanina was matter. I guess I had to rinse it off, but he was matter that it should be eaten. Omar Rava Zok Rava Man Chokim Lemishri Ki Agavno Ilav Rab Chanina Barei Derava Mi Pashrunya. Who would be able to figure out a way to be matter this if not Rab Chanina Barei Derava? Because he must hold. Now we know kutach is quite salty. So if kutach is quite salty, why don't you say that when the little bird fell into it, it now is kireseach and it absorbed like you cooked it together with milchix. Zok to Gemara, you know when Shmuel said milch kireseach, hanamili heicha the eno nechal machabes smolcha. That if it's so salted that it can't even be eaten because of how badly salted. Here there's a machlokas Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi holds it means it's salted like you would salt something to preserve it. That's very, very, very salty and you can't even eat it until it's completely rinsed off. But if you just salt it like you normally salt meat, that Zok Rashi would not be considered kiresach. Tosfos brings rayas that regular salting, the way you would salt meat, is also kiresach. So there's a shaila, Rashi and Tosfos, what the words means of einay nechal bachas bo. Everybody agrees that kutach, sure, it has a lot of salt in it, but harei nechal bachas bo, it's a prepared food, and you eat it that way. So therefore, as salty as it is, it's not kiresach. This only is if the bird fell in when it was raw. Avol tzli, if it was roasted, boy klipa would need klipa. There's actually a shaila in the Rishonim here as well. Are we comparing raw to tzli, or are we comparing cold to hot? There are those who say that chai means if it's cold, and tzli means if it's hot. But if it's roasted, but it's cold now, it also wouldn't be a problem. However, there are those who learn that once it's roasted, now it's soft and it will be by layer. So you'd have to at least take off one layer. And if this bird has a lot of crevices in it, that really allows the kutach to penetrate also. And if it's heavily spiced, so once again it's very soft and it can absorb easily, kule also, the whole thing would be also. You took meat, you didn't salt it before, and you roasted it. So most of the dam would come out of it. And then you took this piece of meat, you put it on a slice of bread, and you slice the meat using the bread as a cutting board. Now, some dam, as you're cutting with your knife, some dam comes out of the meat. So the halacha is kika shechatach halabosar osar lo. You're not allowed to eat. That's only if the place that you cut had an abundance of blood in it. Why? Because it had a bruise there from when the animal was still alive. Right, and that's also only if the blood penetrated the whole slice of bread from one side to the other side. And that's also it's thick blood of a kalish de leslam. Now there's a little bit of a shaila what this is, exactly what this is. So there are those who learn that there's an actual problem of dam here. You roasted it. Teretz roasting takes out all the blood that's going to come out naturally, and therefore any more blood that's in it when you eat it, that's called dam shebifnim, that never left, that's not osir. But when you cut it, that pressure of the knife sucks out more. Now the shaila is, are we talking about mamish and or dam? Which is Hasam Mishanim learn, or are we talking about something that looks like dam, but it's not really dam, and it's only midirabona? Shmuel said it's usher to eat it. Is that the rabbanon, or is that because he holds it's really dam? Anyway, Shmuel Shadi Leila Kalbe. Shmuel would feed it to his dog. Rav Huna Yoiv Leila Shame. Rav Huna would give it to his shamas, his Jewish shamas. Ishari Lakula Alma. Sorry, if it's mutter, it should be mutter for his shamas to eat as well. And the osir, and if he doesn't want to eat it, how can he give it to his shamas? Lakula Alma osir. It should be osir for everybody. The Rishonim have a discussion. If you could bring a rye from this Gemara, that a Rav who's matter something is not allowed to be noik heter himself. If he's matter something, it's mutter for him as well. So Zok to Gemara, Rav Huna would give it to his Shabbos. Zok to Gemara, shiny Rav Huna danina daite. Rav Huna held Levada, this is not dam, it's only oil, and you don't need to worry about it. And there's no gzeir on it. He himself was very delicate. He couldn't handle things. He got disgusted from things. So the reddish moil looked to him disgusting. He couldn't bring himself to eat it. But it wasn't B'Torah's Isser. It was just because he couldn't bring himself to eat it. Rabba ate that reddish moil. He would call it the wine of the meat. In other words, he held it's completely mutter, and there's no dam here at all. Amr Rab Nachman Amr Shmuel, Ein manichin kli. And we pass it like Rava. The ones you roasted meat, there's no problem with eating it. Amr Rab Nachman Amr Shmuel, Ein manichin kli tachas bosor ad sheyichla kol meir ademu b'shabbat. If you want to capture the gravy from meat that you're roasting that hadn't been salted before, you're not allowed to capture that gravy because there'll be dam mixed into that gravy unless there's no more reddish tinge and all of the juices coming out are now clear but not red. That you can capture. Minoya dinan. How could you be so sure to capture anything that there's no drop of red like that? That would be very hard to discern. When you see smoke, in other words, you have a layer of coals underneath what you're roasting. If it's blood falling on it, it's going to slightly extinguish the flame. It's not going to flare up. But if drops fall on the coals and they flare up, now you know it's not dam anymore. Now you know it's fat, and that's why it's flaring up. And there you're allowed to capture because there's no dam left. It's only fat, which is what you want for your gravy. But machkov's lo rabashi, that wouldn't be a good litmus test because v'dilma tasa mota ilay mota. We'd all agree that if the coals are at the bottom, the meat towards the bottom, the piece of meat towards the bottom will get roasted before the part on top. So you might be seeing a flare-up from fat that's dripping off the lower part of the meat, but there still might be actual dam left in the top part of the meat that's also going to drip down into the pan. So how could you possibly rely on that? Now, there are those who say that once any part of the meat is totally roasted, we can be confident at least that there's no dam even in the other part of the meat. And that's what would be the svar of Marshut and Meshwed Rapap. But Rav Ashi still had a problem. Maybe there's still dam in there. The only way you can be sure that you're not going to have to deal with dam is you have to put into the pan only 2 little pieces of salt, which will attract a dam towards it, and then you could skim the fat off the top. Now, this is a very sensitive type of thing because if you put too much salt, it won't work. It has to be just treg loli. And if you look at Rashi, either it's bein ala basar sai if you put it on the meat, ubein b'sayich hakli. Adam nikra eitzel hamelech l'shulayim. The dam will be drawn to the bottom of the pan because of these 2 little grains of salt, and then you can skim off the top. Could we do something like that today? Zok toisvis at the bottom. Don't try this today. But how does it work? Zok toisvis, if we skip to the second to the last line, for Achshav nowadays, we couldn't rely on such a test, on such a process. according to what it says in the halachas. Nice. The dafkin nokat trey glole. It's dafkin two little kernels, not more. Of a harbe melech would do the opposite. Would be poisekay chadam, and then it would mix. And ve'ein onu bekin bedover shloi larba shloi lamai. Since it's so precise, the amount of salt that has to be there to create this attraction to the salt, of the dam to the salt, so that you could separate the fat off it, that's too fine an art, and we're not experts in it today, so we can't try it. Let's turn over on Talmud base. On my way, Rav Acha Bared Rav Hika Rav Ashi. When we are Mar Shmuel Hach, did Shmuel say this halacha? Did Shmuel say this halacha? That once there's no reddish tinge to the juices dripping down, you're allowed to capture the fat? Via Amar Shmuel, didn't we just learn a minute ago from Shmuel that kikar shachata chalabaser, it was a fully roasted piece of meat, and now you cut a piece of meat on a piece of bread? Also, because we are worried that it's dam over there. Zog to Gemara, shiny hasam dagav tuska de sakina pol. With normal roasting, once it runs clear, you don't have to be worried about that. That doesn't mean there's no dam left in the meat. That means there's no dam that's going to drip down on you. Because whatever the fire was going to extract, it has already extracted. Whatever remains in the meat, you can eat it that way. But if you cut it down, now you put pressure on the meat, that will actually squeeze out more dam. That's where there's a problem. Amr Nachman, Dogim v'oifos shamolchan zemz. You were salting meat to get the blood out, but you happen to have had fish there that was salted as well. You didn't need to kasher it, of course. This fish blood is no problem. Yet you happen to have had it there in the mix with the meat. The fish becomes asurin. Rashi says why? The dagim become asur because the dam that comes out of the oifos or the basar will be absorbed, will penetrate the dagim. Zog to Gemara hechada. What exactly is the case? If it's on a rack, the way we normally salt, so everything just runs down. I'm sorry. If it's not on the rack, if it's in a container, so the sear builds up at the bottom, and something at the bottom is going to be literally soaking in the blood. Even would be awesome. And if it's on the rack, why would you say the dagam absorb from the oifos? It's draining down. We are speaking about a rack. How come the dagim are going to be absorbing that from the oifos? Because Zok to Gemara, the dagim mishum derafu karmeyu kadmi upalti. We said the reason why one piece of meat doesn't absorb from the other piece of meat is because dam mishrik sharik, blood doesn't have this penetrating property, and also all the other pieces of meat that you're salting with are busy being pilot, so therefore they won't be boiling. But fish are not pilot for very long; they're very, very soft, and what's going to happen is the plate stops quickly. Since it has a very thin skin, its plata happens quickly, kadmi upalti, and after that plata action has already ceased in the fish, it's still continuing on with the oifos, so they're still being pilot blood. Oifos kamiti, and therefore basar danichi dogim pliti oifos. After the dogim stop being pilot, now they're susceptible to absorb. The oifos are continuing to give out dam, and that's what's going to cause the problem for the fish. The other boy bolimine, and then the fish will be leia from the basar. Rav Mori bar Rochel imlach le basar shchuta ba the basar treifa. Rav Mori bar Rochel salted basar shchuta together with basar treifa. And the question is, yes, there's issue there, but vibalt, they're both being pilot. Maybe the kosher meat won't be absorbing the isudik of fat and tam from the basar treifa because it's torrid in like there's a dam, just like it's not going to be by leia dam from another piece of meat. maybe it won't be below the Isser, another piece of meat. Also, the Kemi the Rabba Amalei Hatameim Lesser Tziron Beroidfon the Kippah Shalahem. Even the roitiv that comes out of the tray for the meat is going to be Isser Mamish. It's not just carrying the tab. It's Isser Mamish, and therefore it will absorb into the other kosher piece of meat, and it will be awesome. So there's really two factors over here. There's the fact that that's Isser Mamish, but it doesn't tell us anything about the fact that it absorbs, that the taste of the treifa will absorb into the kosher meat. Maybe just like it's going to reject dam, it'll reject tam. So that seems to be something that the Gemara took for granted. So Zok Rashi, the bottom Rashi, lesser chirin v'rayt from the kippah, pirma is boser v'tablan and nikva b'shulak there. It's the mush that's gathered at the bottom of the pot. Chimon the tzir noser, since the tzir is oser, mitzir aboser hashachut, the shechted meat that's salted together with the treifa meat will become oser. Machmas tzir treifa, and the punchline here is shehu noyach livola min adam. Even though when a piece of meat is busy excreting dam, it won't be boilei dam, but that won't protect it from being boilei tzir, because tzir is easier to absorb than dam. So up to Gemara, the lema. So let's just turn over onto Daf Kuf Yud Gimel. The lema for Gemara. Why did Gemara pick this brisa that tells us that tzir is just like the Isser itself? The lema de Shmuel. We could have just quoted Shmuel's halacha that we've been discussing until now. So since it's like it's cooking, that's why it absorbs its here. But we would still be missing a critical piece of information. I would have thought when you say kavish kamavuchel or maliach kereseach, that's legabe being b'rei adam. But how do I know that the svara of maliach kereseach will also allow it to absorb other things? Maybe loy kamash malon. That's why we need the brisa to tell us that the tzir and the roitiv will also be absorbed up into the heterodictomy. Okay. Let's have a look at Tosfos on the last topic, because what we just learned poses a huge problem. If you're telling me that now you have to gauge when the meat finishes to be poiled, so since the fish finishes to be poiled earlier, now it's open to absorbing dam, that's what oif is osir. So we have a massive problem, because every time you salt, you don't salt each piece of meat at the same time. You first salt one piece of meat really well, you put it on the rack. Then you salt another piece of meat and you put it on the rack. And then you salt a third piece of meat and put it on the rack. What's happening over here? The salting at the bottom, the first piece of meat is obviously going to be finished before the ones on top of it, because they started the process first. So how come we don't have a problem? Every time you salt multiple pieces of meat in our regular koshering, why doesn't the last piece of meat that you put the salt on, why doesn't that time get nivla into the pieces of meat that already finished the process? Because it started the process early. That is the big problem that we have in this sugya. And that is Tosfos' kasha. So I'm going to look here. This is in the Rashi in Tosfos Dibur Machal B'Dagim, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines into the wide lines. Rashi's pshat that said that it's all about when the plate, the process finishes, it's going to be susceptible to absorb. How do you ever salt meat together? When you salt each piece one after the other, and you pile them up on top of each other, which is how we do our salting, you pile them up. Even though there's multiple pieces of meat there, even though the first piece of meat is going to finish the process the earliest because it started the earliest. Mashma You're allowed to salt it like that. Even though the bottom piece of meat is going to be finished the process first, why? Why the mutter? Even your plate is at taklin kadeves. So therefore, Toynshis has several pshat. So pshat number one that Toynshis offers is v'nira da'anu taima mishum the dam mishik shark b'malicha b'moy b'tzliya. We know that when dam is running down, it doesn't penetrate other pieces of meat. When you're roasting meat, you could roast one meat on top of the other piece. Remember we discussed earlier with the spit, you have to have the liver on the bottom, but if it's all meat, you can line them up no matter what. The dam from the upper pieces are dripping down onto the lower pieces. Even though the meat towards the bottom will already finish being pilot because it gets roasted faster. So tzara but there's still no problem mishum the mishrik sharik, because dam has a property that it doesn't get reabsorbed into other meat. So therefore, hu adinami b'malicha the sharik hagav. Malicha would also be mutter in that case because the dam will not penetrate even a piece of meat that the salt reaction already finished. The dagim dafka mishum the rafu karmayu asiri. It's only fish that are usher because they have a very thin skin. Mishum the rikichi. The soft skin will also allow dam to penetrate into the fish. But the shark minayu won't just bounce off it like the wood with meat. What if the top surface of the lower piece of meat had indentations in it that would capture some of this liquid draining down? Like shark. Kacha, we still have a problem. Lama yehe mutar. Why would it be mutar? And of course it is mutar. The maitzin b'chol yorim. Shemoitin gumoit b'chatifa isatachtoinois malay sear. But no, how do I have to? When you salt meat, it's very possible that one of the pieces of meat has a little cavity in it. That sear that drains down into it gathers, and we don't have a problem there. And say that it's going to be absorbing. Zok Toishvis, I'm going to give you an answer why it's not a problem. The plate as tsir moishekas harbe acher plate adam. This property that once, while it's being pilot, it can be by leia. It's not only while it's being pilot adam. You're right. The bottom meat will finish being pilot down much sooner than the top piece of meat because the process started sooner. But even after it finishes secreting down, it's continuing to secrete tsir. And as long as it's secreting anything, and that secretion runs for many, many hours, while it's secreting anything at all, it won't be able to absorb them. Because it will even excrete anything that it might have absorbed from the upper pieces of meat. Even after it finished being pilot down, because it's still in a mode that it's secreting. And therefore, any sear, liquid, salt, blood, whatever it's mixed together, that you find in those little cavities in the meat, there's no dominant. It's only sear, it's only juice, below dam. But when it comes to fish, like our Mishnah, our Gemara says, fish finish secreting very, very quickly. And they'll finish secreting everything before the meat near it finishes secreting its dam. Therefore, there'll be a time where the dog is not secreting anything at all, yet the meat that's with it is still secreting dam. But when you're dealing with multiple pieces of meat, the pieces of meat that finish secreting dam, they're going to continue to secrete for a long, long time, and they're for sure going to be secreting they'll continue to be secreting after the upper pieces of meat finish secreting dam. So therefore, there's no concern. That was pshat number one. But for Rabbi Yosy Meirlin's a little bit of a different twist. If you should play this hadogim, Nigmar koidim hascholas pleitas ha'ifis. He holds that the pleitas ha'dugim finishes so fast, even before the pleitas ha'ifis start. The kak ein polta noid mashaboyim and ha'ifis. Aber boser, kiven shlo nigmar pleitas dam tachtoi, koidim hascholas pleitas ha'ifis. By the time the upper pieces of meat start the chemical reaction, might be 10 minutes later, by the time you finish piling them all up, the bottom one is still secreting down. It might finish earlier, but at least it started by the time the process had already begun on the upper pieces of meat. What's the advantage of that? Because if he's a pleitas hadogim nigmar koidim ascholas pleitas oifus, the kakin poltenoid masha boilim in the oifus. Aber boser given shlo nigmar pleitas dam tachtoi koidim ascholas pleitas in elyon ein derech pleitas on the stemis. You will say that the stuff on the bottom, even though it finished its own natural reaction of pleita, but since there's still secretions coming from above, that continues the process of pleita even on the bottom pieces. The Hailu Pasuach Lifloid, once the bottom piece of meat started, they will not finish secreting as long as there's meat above them that's also in that secretion mode. Lo yistam ad gmar pleitas chatichas shola. V'chein mochu shlishish v'nosnu al yoinois. Koidim gmar pleitaso etachtoidu pleitas ashetigmar hashlishish pleitaso v'chein lo'ilo. So basically, the chemical reaction does not stop until there's nothing left for any of the pieces of meat in the pile to secrete. Otherwise, the secretion will continue even on the lower pieces of meat. And therefore, there's no problem salting multiple pieces of meat together. So then Tosfos gets into a whole discussion of why aren't we concerned that there's still dam in the salt, and the dam in the salt will become once again nivla into the pieces of meat lower on. So there he says, we don't have to worry because whatever's absorbed in the salt will never come out, and any liquid is no longer considered dam. Then we had another interesting story that happened in Rashi's house. And I'm going to skip down to about 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of Tosfos, where Tosfos says, Ma'aseh beveisai shel Rashi. And what happened was, let's just start a little bit higher up. V'heika sheshah b'oseh b'melach k'shir tzliya al daf echad. You did your proper salting on a rack, and then after you finished salting, you took the meat and you sat it into a container, into a bucket. V'shasham kol alayla, and it sat there all night. It's continuing to secrete, but you already left it to salt the amount of time required to extract the blood, and now it's sitting in a big vat altogether with the salt on it. So the halacha is v'shasham kol alayla v'achach nimtza kli molei mitz min hamaliach. And then when you came in the morning, there was like 6 inches of juice that continued to come out of the meat that's piled up inside this vat. So even this happened actually in Rashi's house. The Heship, and Rashi answered, since it was kashered properly with salt, before you put it into the vat, even though now in the vat it's sitting in some type of juice that might have blood in it, whatever comes out of the meat after that point, it's not blood. It's juice, and therefore all that meat is mutter. And I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you that this has to be non-blood. Anything that comes out after the amount of time that you require to salt. Why is that? Because if it wasn't that way, if you say whatever comes out is still osir, you'd have a problem. The mikoyach zebonu lesser basar anoifel b'isem moichel levishiyesh b'roiv melach shalabasar ve'enoi nechal machmas mochel lechashev kariseyach b'oisher sabasar. If you're going to say that moichel is isser And now when the meat sits in there, it's reabsorbing. Iser, if you're going to hold like that, well then game Gami Tamzeh Yetzer Kol Abosar Sheboilo. It would be impossible to kasher meat. Because what do you do after the meat's salted? You put it into a vat and rinse it off. So now the mali mai mali machal. What's the difference in what it is? Even to shneim shel heter. If you're going to say that stuff that comes out of the meat after the shear of malicha is still dam, so then anytime you salt it, now you rinse off the meat, when you rinse it off, it's going to be reabsorbing the dam. You have to say, shadam shebemelach, any dam that's absorbed into the salt, misyabish, it's dried up in the salt, it will never leave that salt and go back into the meat. It will remain in its place. Even though now that dam that was in the salt is now diluted in the water that you're rinsing it with in this tub, it's never going to go back into the meat. Just like we're not concerned if there's a cavity in the meat that Michael will gather in it, dripping down from pieces of meat that are above it on the rack, we're not worried about it. Because once salt extracts dam, that dam's not going back into any. The mali gumar malayatzir, mali kalabosa b'sekatzir. What's the difference if there's a pocket that's tzir gathers together on the surface of the meat, or if the whole meat's dipped into that? Either way, the same way we're not worried that there's dam in there that's going to absorb back into the meat, we're not worried about any little cavity. Or maybe the concept of Beliach Tereseach is now finished. The salt doesn't permanently create Resichos. Once it creates the Resichos once, it loses its potency, and there it's V'lechashav Tereseach. We do hold that if you take meat after you salt it, and you put it into a vat, whatever meat sitting in the liquid, below the level of the liquid, should not be used. So this is mamash halacha l'maisa. We don't salt our own meats, but for someone who does, it's very relevant.
I don't understand. Why aren't we worried about it? Is this a fact that it doesn't reabsorb, or just a theory that it doesn't reabsorb?
When Rishonim are saying things, we have to say it's fact. How could they be matter the Isser Dam over a theory?
No, so if it's a fact, so why is it even an issue?
Well, till we become aware of the fact from the Rishonim, we would not know it.
So they're saying there is blood down there, but it doesn't reabsorb.
Correct. Well, there has to be blood there because obviously the salt that was on the meat absorbed that blood. That blood didn't disappear into thin air. So they needed a scientific reason why chemically that blood's not being reabsorbed into the meat. So we had two svaros in the Rishonim, either because the salt loses its potency to create resichas, or because the dam no longer will go back into meat once it's sucked out. Now, today with laboratories, they could probably do a chemical analysis and see what's actually happening.
Right.
But maybe we don't want to try that because it might make us have a share.
Okay.
I don't know if I was allowed. I don't even know if I was allowed to say that.
You can erase it from the.
Okay.
All right, Shkoyach.